Hey everyone, welcome to Beyond Words, conversations on language, music, and mind in collaboration with speechtherapypd.com. I'm your host, Garrett Oyama. I'm a musician, a practicing SLP, and a PhD student with an interest in all things language, music, and cognition, and graphics. And so I'm so excited that we have the one and only Dr. Neil Cohn with us today. Dr. Neil is a cognitive scientist and director of the Visual Language Lab, where he studies the structure and cognition of drawings and sequential images like comics and how people make meaning from them. His work argues that some systems of drawing can be understood as visual languages with structured patterns that can be studied using methods from linguistics, cognition, and neuroscience. Before we get started, just a couple of items to mention. Most of these upcoming podcasts, including today's, will include an accompanying course on speech therapy PD that is available for Point One ASHA CEUs. Just some disclosures, we each receive some compensation from Speech Therapy PD for this podcast. And Dr. Cohn is the author of several books, which we may discuss today, including Speaking in Pictures, A Vision of Language, and A Multimodal Language Faculty. So without further ado, Dr. Cohn, welcome to Beyond Words. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, super excited to chat today. I was wondering, I always asked the guests a little bit about their origin story, and it seems like
Yeah.
you have a particularly colorful one. So I was wondering
Uh,
if you could talk a little bit about how you got into this field of research.
yeah. I think so. I wouldn't have thought that I'd get into language studies, even though I probably have a lot of the markers of somebody who would eventually go into linguistics, like, you know, being into Elvish dialects from Tolkien and you know,
That's a
enjoying reading the
sign, a strong
dictionary and
sign.
things. These are strong markers, I think, that many people share. But I wouldn't have thought that. I always just wanted to draw comics as a profession, and I was drawing comics and really into comics since I was a kid. I started working in the comic industry in the United States when I was a teenager. I'm from Southern California originally, though I live in the Netherlands currently. And I started working at Comic-Con International, which was right around the corner from me.
So cool.
Before it was called Comic-Con International, it was San Diego Comic-Con, and I worked there for Image Comics in the 90s. So I was kind of in the industry since I was 14, and then just intended to draw comics. But when I was in college, happened to take a course on linguistics because my roommate was going to take it and said, "Hey, you should take this class on linguistics with me." And I thought, well, I went to college just with the intent to kind of inspire me about things to draw comics about and my own personal interests. And I thought, well, I've always thought really theoretically about the graphics in comics, but I don't know that much about language. So I should study something about language too. And so I took this linguistics course, and in that class, I started recognizing that things that were happening in the structure of language, as was posited by linguistics, were really similar to the things that I understood about how graphics worked. And I then started kind of looking into this and thinking deeply about this and theorizing, and I started getting more into the ways in which graphics and comics were structured than I was interested in drawing stories anymore. And then I went the route of going into a psychology PhD program, which is essentially cognitive neuroscience and linguistics. I kind of had a dual focus with different mentors, and then continued along my way, kind of building up this study of the psycholinguistics of graphics, in particular focusing on comics. But I think my argument is that this is really about the capacity to make pictures. Generally, the human capacity to make pictures in the same way that we have this human capacity to speak. And my overarching argument is that those are the same, essentially,
Yeah.
in cognitive terms, is that the the even though on the outside our experience of different behaviors like speaking and drawing seem really different, they are all coming from the same brain. And so uh, part of like one kind of counterpoint might be, why would the brain do radically different things for all of our different behaviors, as opposed to having consistent cognitive mechanisms that are brought to bear across all of these different expressive systems, as we call them. There's not really good terms for these in a general way because people tend to parcel them out. But we've tried to come up with ways to talk about them in consistent terms. And so most of my research has been toward showing that graphics share the same sort of building block structure as languages, other languages, I'll say, that the graphic
Yeah.
systems rise to what I call visual languages if they have enough complexity to them. Otherwise, they're kind of at the level of like, well, the best analogy is if you think about uh, sign languages are full real languages with complete, say, a lexicon and a grammar. Is the best way to
Hmm.
easily put it. Gestures are not full languages. Gestures are systems that we use when we gesticulate and communicate, but they don't have, and they may have a limited vocabulary. So that we have certain things that are conventionalized, like thumbs up, thumbs down, other
Yeah.
expletives and whatnot.
Yeah.
Um, but there's not really a grammar there. And so I would say that
Right.
visual languages have a full lexicon and grammar, as is found in many different graphic systems, particularly comics are very rich. But
Yeah.
there's the diminished version of the capacity to draw is more like gestures, which is what is
Uh,
essentially what happens when people can't draw.
yeah. Like
So
co-speech gestures, right? Like,
co-speech gestures, yeah, like what I'm doing right now, effectively.
right, right, right.
um, and for people who can see me. And that's the equivalent of what happens when I can't draw. Is you haven't learned a complete visual language yet. But you retain an innate capacity to create pictures, just like you maintain an innate capacity to
Right.
gesture, whether or not you learn a sign language. So
Yeah.
that's been the thrust of my research for over 25 years now, since I was in college, essentially.
Wow. Yeah,
That's
this
my
is
origin
amazing.
story. There you go.
So cool. And this connects really well. I like this point you make that we've just sort of overemphasized the vocal modality to like to the point where like language and the vocal modality are like synonymous. And so we've kind
Hmm.
of like pushed these things. Oh, maybe, there's gesture over here. There's like drawing over here, but they're kind of to the side. And it's like, it's funny. We have speech and language therapy, but there's no like gesture and language therapy or like drawing and language therapy. So we really like, we've sort of missed this connection, this deeper connection that, the language faculty actually crosses modalities, perhaps.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. So we make an argument, and it's one that I've been making for years, but we finally kind of consolidated into our recent book that you mentioned, A Multimodal Language Faculty, which I will say is a fairly technical book. It is a very rigorous linguistics-y book compared to my other book, Speaking in Pictures, which just came out, which is a graphic novel that I drew. So they are kind of polar sides of
Great.
accessibility. But the argument that we make about multimodality is that there's kind of two almost oppositional assumptions that people make about the character of what language is. On the one hand, people believe it's kind of rooted in speech as the prototypical form of language, and it lends to a kind of speech focus where people are interested in speech sounds and speech structure, and um, that it carries with it an idea that, say, there's a hierarchy of behaviors where speech is at the top, and then all the other ones are kind of supportive behaviors. So that is
Right.
like spoken language is your primary language, and then gestures are there for support, pictures are there for support, in support of this primary thing. So this is core versus peripheral distinctions, we might call it.
Hmm.
And it also carries with it this notion of a primary communicative modality, that there is one main thing that you carry your meaning in and expressions in, and the rest are off to the side. So we sometimes call this like unimodal bias or primary communicative bias. On the opposite side, there's an assumption that even though there is this speech bias, that language is ultimately amodal, by which I mean that its language as a phenomena is not connected to speech, that you have language and it manifests in speech, it manifests in sign, it manifests in writing, and thus the notion of language is kind of mutable and amodal. And somehow people live with this cognitive dissonance between language both being speech as primary and language being amodal,
Mm,
and it leads to this, but they're held as at the same time as maintaining. And what we
yeah.
argue is that both of those are wrong, essentially, to put it in kind of flippant terms. What we argue is that the kind of communicative capacity, the language faculty, is actually inherently multimodal.
Mm,
And it's multimodal specifically for three modalities. That is producing sounds with our mouths, moving our bodies, which I'm also doing right now with my fingers, and
yeah.
drawing things, creating graphic marks that are then meaningful. And what we argue is that human beings as a species are naturally have these three expressive capacities. And this has to do not just with the sensory systems that we access meaning through, but the ways in which we especially produce meaningful signals. We don't produce, like,
Yeah.
other animals emit electrical pulses to each other to communicate and feel through touch. We don't do that. We have and kind of a adaptation to use, say, braille or touch for meaning, but we don't produce touch. We don't produce bumps naturally in any sort of way. So that's not a natural modality. And you can also look at natural modalities in terms of, say, what children naturally will do in the course of development through just exposure
Hmm.
and practice. And we can come back to that. Um, so our argument is that
Yeah.
these three channels are innate to humans, and they are parallel systems that are ultimately linked in one system. So it's like a what's the like a I always have the image of like a hydra, which is five heads, but this is three. So it's like
Or
three.
Cerberus with the
Yeah, Cerberus.
three-headed
There we
dog.
go. Thank you.
Yeah.
Better mythological creature to make an analogy to. So it's three heads, one body. So there is a connection between them all, but they're not independent.
I
And they're
see.
also
Yeah.
not the same. So the amodal part is so what I like to say is there's no ranking between them. That's what I'm trying to say. It's
Yeah.
not that the vocal part is primary and the body and the graphics are tertiary or ancillary. It's that they're parallel, but they have different ways that they do stuff. And in development, people may or may not develop proficiency in all of them. Um, so what you end up with, though, so we can now explain where the idea of amodality comes from. Is if you have a cultural assumption of a primary communicative capacity, that is, we mainly use
Mm,
one. If you believe that we mainly use just one, and you have a system that is inherently three, those three will look like they are options
yeah.
for something amodal, rather than simply being three parallel things that operate in complementary ways, because humans are ultimately multimodal by nature, not
Yeah.
unimodal or ranked systems. They're parallel systems inside of this one, Cerberus of a
Yeah.
capacity. So that's
Well, it's
that's
like,
the guiding idea, right? Is
yeah.
that and that view fundamentally, when you adopt that view, you start recognizing that it fundamentally changes the way you think about all of language and the way in which society has been built in speech-centric ways. One of the ways that I like to point out, and then I'll let you ask another question, which is, if you go to a lecture room, usually what you see is there is a podium with a standing mic and a screen which is up in no way for a human to actually reach. This is a speech-centric interior design method, right? Because if it was truly multimodal, there would be a way for one, the speaker would not be locked in place. Two, they would be able to go to where, in this our cultural situation, graphics might be projected if we're not
Mm,
drawing on a chalkboard anymore, because that would be the more
mhm.
natural way to do it. But like, if you can't point and interact with the graphics, then you're not creating a completely multimodal signal anymore. So just
Mm,
the design of say, a regular classroom is speech centric oftentimes. And it's just a
interesting.
subtle thing that reinforces our social biases for speech censorship. Now,
Wow.
obviously, we have a culture that is built up to be very speech-centric. The last thing I'll point out along that line is oftentimes people don't recognize the degree to which our society is shaped by drawing. Because we think about speech as this primary all-encompassing thing, and maybe writing, which writing is essentially the connection of the speech to the natural pictorial system to
Mm.
draw sounds effectively, which
Hmm.
is why it's so unnatural and takes so much time to do, is because you're repurposing this thing that's for something else. Um, but much of society is based on drawings. So everything in my room was a drawing before it was designed to be this room. My chair was a
Right.
drawing, the computer was a drawing, my technology is a drawing. You know, people sketch out, a blueprint of my house. There's like all these
Yeah.
things are drawings first, but after the fact, they disappear from being drawings because they get built as real life stuff. Our clothes were probably drawings. You have drawings
Yeah.
on your clothes.
Yeah.
Um, so in addition to the clothes themselves likely having been drawn. So there is drawing is also a bedrock of human society, just often invisible
Mm.
uh, uh, in our daily interactions.
Yeah.
So that's the big thing.
Yeah. And it makes me, yeah, think it's like the reason that LLMs are, at the forefront getting so much attention is maybe this like sort of speech language bias, or something like that. And the fact that we now are seeing, oh, there's like a lot of edge cases where, you can't get speech to very easily like envision the product exactly the way that you want to make it, or,
Yes.
like it's not as good as those things at those things. And
Yeah,
so
I will say I'm not an expert at LLMs or artificial intelligence sort of research. I can say though that the most of these are all trained on text, which is not natural language.
right.
I know they call it natural language
Right. They call it
processing.
NLP, that natural
Yeah,
language
NLPs,
processing.
but
Right.
it's not actually natural language in the truly biological sense because it's based on text, which is a reduced form that is based on the mapping of spoken language into graphics that make those graphics do things that are not natural to the graphic modality. Now,
Yeah.
artificial
Wow.
intelligence that's run on pictures is doing it to natural graphic production, but the spoken the written language stuff that's not what natural language is. Natural language is speaking,
Yeah.
um, and drawing, and so if you have the idea that you are using LLMs as a model of say language competence, you are immediately going in with a reduced form of the language system that you are attempting to analyze. And this is true of most all of linguistics also. Linguistics was largely founded on the study of text in the 1800s, text corpora of different languages,
Yeah.
not actual speech. And then there was a branch of, say, early psycholinguistics that then looked at speech specifically. But even notions like sentence, word, those come from speech, or so come from text, not from speech.
Hmm.
Because the notion of word as a consolidated unit comes from writing systems, not
Right.
from how spoken things work, which is why sometimes people have trouble segmenting where word boundaries are or not, right?
Yeah. It's
When
like,
they're
yeah, like you
writing.
mentioned.
So there is kind of a misperception that writing is the canonical form of language, partially built up because we spend so much time in education learning how to read and write. But we do that because it's not natural. We have to
Yeah.
do that
Yeah.
to force us to know how to read and write because we're not going to get it naturally the same way you would through exposure and practice by just, you know, being exposed to speaking and then, learning the properties of it. And then, of course, speech therapy and
Yeah.
things like that are maybe that process doesn't go as natural as it might, and you want to adjust things, right? Something along those lines. But you can't do that
Yeah.
with reading and writing. You have to like force it
Right.
upon through instruction.
Yeah. It's also like way more recent in evolutionary times, like few hundred years old versus thousands and thousands of years old. And
Yeah.
yeah. But I was thinking that this your approach just gels perfectly with the kind of the 4E cog sci like approach that language, we should think about it in a way that's, or, cognition more broadly, but especially language faculty, we should be thinking about it in terms of like something that's embodied, ecological,
Yeah.
tied to,
Yeah.
tied to, felt dynamics and the environment and things like
Yeah.
that.
So I can say I'm not big into embodied cognition. I'm not opposed to it per se, but typically the way embodied cognition oftentimes was a reactionary thing to, say, highly symbolicized linguistic meaning, right? So the idea was that you have different sorts of sensory systems that contribute to meaning as opposed to just this pure symbol. And again, all of these are byproducts of the way that linguistics developed to begin with, because why do people think it's purely these abstract symbols? Well, that's because it developed from writing. The theories
Yeah.
developed from writing originally.
Right.
And they happen to choose, say, semiotic systems that emphasize arbitrariness rather than those that had more multiplicity, like those of C.S. Peirce, which emphasize, say, a mix of these things. Also, linguistics generally has a problem with differentiating arbitrariness or symbolicity from conventionality or patterning, but those are not the same thing. So people generally think, well, language is arbitrary because and conventional, but those are orthogonal. You can have conventional things that are iconic, and that doesn't make them more symbolic. It just means that they are conventional iconic things. So a smiley
Like a
face,
bathroom
stick
sign or
figures,
something.
bathroom sign. So I love the bathroom sign example, because the bathroom sign example shows that you have the separation between the regularity of the signal, where the conventionality is, and how it derives its meaning. So the bathroom sign is a highly conventionalized depiction of let's say, man and woman, for let's say what we might identify as a man and a woman,
Yeah.
right? Now, it's the signal is just graphic lines or shapes. That's where the conventionalization is, the highly regularized signal. It maps to meaning as signaling a man and a woman, which is an iconic reference. That means it looks like what it resembles. But it's also has a symbolic meaning for a bathroom,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Concurrently, these are not opposition. They are both activated for that sign. The bathroom isn't, it doesn't look like bathrooms. It is
Yeah.
a symbolic meaning for bathroom. And it is what we call indexical for the location of a bathroom based on where it is placed. So the three primary types of meaning making, iconicity, indexicality, and symbolicity, are all done by this same highly conventionalized representation. So there's no conflation between these things, right? They are orthogonal to each other. I was talking about something else. We talked about bathroom signs. LLMs and embodied cognition. That's where I was. So embodied cognition. Embodied cognition was a reaction to the idea that these are abstract, arbitrary symbols. And so you have this multiplicity of concepts. I kind of took that for granted. My mentor's model was essentially the model that originally inspired a lot of the embodied cognition research, but then they all forgot that he was the origin of it. And so then they don't credit him, they credit the book that referenced him. So because he didn't talk about it in those terms. So I just took this as like a normal thing. It wasn't like it was a revolutionary idea. It was, oh yeah, of course there's lots of different sensory information that is converging on a common hub, we would say in psychology now, of meaning, but that meaning is not the stuff of senses. It's a abstract hub that connects to all this different information. That said, my model, I think, is embodied in a way that doesn't even need that distinction, because it's embodied in the sense that there is no dissociation between language as an abstract amodal thing and the modalities. The modalities are part of that system.
Yeah.
And modalities naturally have parts of the body. So in order to speak, I have to use my vocal apparatus and my ears
Yeah.
to hear, and I'm going to move my body to produce bodily movements. And to create graphic images, I'm going to use some sort of bodily movement to create a trace. And that might be a digital
Yeah.
trace. It might be a trace on sand. It might be with using an instrument on paper or something, or a
You
canvas.
talk about your kid making a milk drawing and
Yes.
smearing milk, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
um, and yeah, but that is part of the human body. The capacity to create those modalities are linked to the human body itself. It's not
Yeah.
that language is disconnected from those capacities, but it's also not like it's the modality part in this sense that is really embodied.
Yeah. I see.
Whatever you think of the meaning part, the modalities themselves are part of our body, and that is part of our linguistic faculty, because the language part is not dissociated from that.
Mm. Yeah. I see. Yeah. It's really like, I don't know, would you think about it as like just the physiological constraints that are associated with kind of the how we make meaning as humans, or
Yeah, yeah. So I think, like I said, I think we have three modalities: vocal, bodily, and graphic. And with those modalities, they carry constraints for how they shape the meaning that they access. So I believe
Mm.
that the view that I see that psychology is kind of converged on is that there's like a hub of meaning in the brain, of semantic memory, that isn't necessarily, the term is supramodal, is the one that people like. It's a supramodal hub of meaning. So that means that there aren't parts of it there's not visual meanings and verbal meanings.
Hmm.
But it's also not like a modal meaning in the like arbitrary abstract symbols that get like lit up. It's a giant network of features of meaning. And the
Yeah.
idea
Okay.
then from us is that the stuff of meaning, all these features, this giant network of features, is accessed by our different expressive modalities. And the way that those modalities access that giant distribution of that network may be different, because modalities come with different constraints. So
Hmm.
spoken language is comes out in a temporal fashion, linearly, like sound has a inherent temporality, which means it has
Hmm.
this inherent linearity to the signal of sound.
Yeah.
Which I'm suddenly very aware of, like my speech sounds in my mouth right now. Um, as opposed to the body, which is spatial, but also infers across a duration of time. So there is a temporality to gestures, but there's also a additional, say, 3D structure that's also visual, that
Yeah.
constrains the way that meaning gets expressed
I see.
differently
Yeah.
than the way that sound does it. And graphics use marks that constrain meaning in yet a different way, because of the way in which that substance happens. Now, graphics are also an interesting one, because you can draw something, you don't see what my process, and I just show it to you, and now you have the finished product. Now the
Hmm.
temporality is gone, right? So you don't see the process that it went through, and it might sustain. So that signal may just stay on that piece of paper for ages, or in the case
Yeah.
of cave drawings, for 50,000 years,
Linear.
it's on the wall there, right? Um, so the substance and the visuals have a different way of access, as opposed to the speech, which disappears immediately. Now,
Yeah.
that might be different if you draw in sand,
Right.
where you draw in sand, wave comes, your
Goes
drawing's
away.
gone, right?
Yeah.
So now
Yeah.
it's just as ephemeral as the speaking, right? It doesn't sustain
Yeah.
there anymore. So there's a materiality to things that may play a role, but they constrain meaning in different ways based on how that channel packages meaning. And it gets even more complicated based on substances. For example, if I'm drawing in sand, it doesn't allow for as much detail as if I'm drawing with a ballpoint pen on paper.
Yeah.
So the complexity that you can express in your graphic system changes based on whether you're drawing in sand versus on paper also.
Cool.
And that leads to different encoded patterns, right?
Yeah. I was thinking, I wonder if, because, the speech signal degrades so fast, and in the graphic modality, you can have sort of meaning that stays there that you can see. I wonder if it's something that we could use as evaluation. If you assume that there's you can evaluate the language faculty across domains, then I wonder if like you can tease out working memory as a factor in someone's, because one thing that we do in speech evaluations is that we give these kids tests, and like we're realizing now so many of the tests are like just a big working memory test. Like find the star that's next to the thing that's under the thing or whatever. It's like these weird cognitive, like we're not exactly testing the language faculty directly,
right?
Or
right.
the in the spoken modality.
Yes.
But so I wonder if like,
yeah,
and this is related to a larger point I wanted to ask about, is that maybe you can use, given that the graphic modality, you do need to learn it, which is a crazy thing. It's like it's you're not automatic. It's not like a core knowledge thing where kids come out and they just know what's happening. You actually have to gain fluency in this.
That's right.
In this skill.
So I'll come back to that. I want to say one additional thing about the kind of persistingness of graphics versus speech, which is when you then convert speech into graphics, like with writing, then it does persist.
Yeah.
So that's why you can access the writings of people from thousands of years ago, because it has persisted. You don't know what they sounded like, but you can see the writing system. So it does persist, and that does give it a way to persist, but it's no longer its native place in that sense, because it's now infused in graphics. The other part that I'll add is there are, of course, places where graphics also have a temporality, because when you draw them in time, is that in time may matter. So the example I always like to give is a coach drawing plays unfurls in time. You go here, you go here. That's drawing. It's unfurling in time, and the time now matters, right? But this happens in lots of places. And if you are able to see the process by which somebody draws, you can better learn how to draw, because you see the process unfolding, as opposed to if I draw, then show it to you, and you want to learn how to draw that thing that I've just showed to you, or that you re-see in a book, and you're like, I want to draw that. You have no idea how that was reconstructed, how that was formed. So you just have to figure out the reconstruction of that. And you don't know if you're doing it the quote unquote right way, or the most effective way, or the way that the original author did, right? So the temporality is a key component of drawing, but because of the atemporal way in which it can persist, sometimes that temporality disappears. That's the idea. So to go back to what you were saying, so you were talking about the way of evaluating things, or the children's acquisition. It seems like you were going in that direction, maybe, or graphics needing to be learned, maybe.
Right. Maybe we could talk about that for a second, because one thing that blew my mind when I heard you first on the podcast was just that, number one, that the idea that comics have a grammatical structure, and then two, that like this had to be learned. And it's not, again, not something that you just pop out with and you understand, which I think I had this assumption for a very long time that, and speech therapists were totally terrible. I think we're terrible. Maybe it's just me, but we show kids like these, like, panels to teach sequencing, or we show them little visuals and comic strips, and we just assume that they know what's going on. Even in AIC devices, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but like some kids that are maybe nonverbal or limited speaking, like they'll use symbols to talk, and sometimes they like chain symbols together. But it's really, really important that we understand that this is not something that is just an innate knowledge to us, but like like you have that example of the study where kids under 4 don't understand this idea of referential continuity, where you have one like if you have a sequence of a few panels, and like a kid is like holding a bowl and then drops it or something, they don't maybe understand it initially that that's the same kid, where it
That's
seems
right.
so obvious to us.
That's right.
Yeah, so I don't know, maybe
Yeah,
yeah.
so acquisition processes are very interesting to me. And I first kind of encountered this as I was in, like, right after my college. I was trying to find grad school. I actually had a really hard time finding a PhD program that would take me because I want to do the stuff that nobody did. So, like, everybody was like, no, this seems really interesting, but we don't know who can work with you. So it took me several years to get in. And I ended up auditing some classes still at my alma mater, which was UC Berkeley, where I went to school. And I took classes with Dan Slobin, who was a pseudo advisor for me for a year. He's like foster advisor, I call him.
Cool.
And one of them was language acquisition. So I was learning all about language acquisition processes. And I had to I wrote a paper then about language acquisition. I was like, well, what is drawing acquisition like? And I went and looked at the drawing acquisition literature, which is largely in the field of art education. And it looks exactly the same as language development, except that they
Huh.
talk about it in completely different ways and with a completely different mindset. So it's like, as if you were looking at the process of language development, but you had a completely different set of assumptions about what this was, and thus you interpret it in a completely different way. For
Mm.
example, there seemed to be a critical or crucial learning period that apexes at puberty. But in the art education literature, they call puberty a period of oppression where people lose interest in drawing. And I read that and thought,
Interesting.
that's not a period of oppression. That's
Yeah.
the apex of a critical learning period
Yeah.
where people are no longer receiving the practice in drawing anymore. And you, in fact, don't see that apex in other places, like in Japan, where kids grow up drawing and they have the rich manga around them all the time. Pretty much everybody can draw a manga because they grow up drawing manga, and you don't see any period of oppression in Japan. So
Yeah.
um, I was like, it's just a flipped mindset of what this process is. And um, along those lines, so we were talking about babbling at one point as well. Drawing has a babbling stage. It's called the scribbling stage. And
Hmm.
um, in the scribbling stage, just like in language, speech context, people don't entirely know what the babbling stage is. Some people say, well, it's just playing with in this case, graphemes instead of phonemes. But other people argue that those graphemes are actually indicative of meaning, just highly reduced and underspecified and hard to grasp what they may or may not be intending to express. Um, uh, and as children progress, they do use various constraints on how they learn how to draw and how they represent things. Oftentimes, for example, lines represent whole volumes, or a whole scribble will represent just a giant region. It's not a line anymore. It's a region to them.
Hmm.
So, and this is all part of the process by which they understand these things. So the other part of that is this aspect of proficiency that we talked about. So one, kids are going through developmental stages where they are learning to draw.
Mhm.
Learning a visual language is a better way to put it. It's not that they are learning to draw. That's like saying learning to speak. When you learn to speak, you learn to speak a particular language or multiple languages. My kids are all bilingual. So um
Cool.
uh my son is like learning multiple languages at the same time, right? And having to learn how to differentiate those. He's also learning to draw because I make sure we do stuff with drawing.
Yeah.
Um my yeah. Um the But learning to draw, we just leave it at that. But really, it's learning to draw a visual language if you are
Mhm.
learning a visual language. So in Japan, they are learning a visual language, which is the visual language that's predominant in manga. In other cultures, it might not be so forthcoming of what visual language that you are learning because there's a multiplicity of graphics, and you may or may not be actually acquiring any of those in particular while you're drawing. You're just and someone might be saying don't copy at the same time, which means you're going to have to invent your own language, which is, highly demanding and defeating, and likely
Yeah. Yeah.
that's probably why people don't learn how to draw, is my argument. So that's a process. The other side of that is there is an acquisition process and a developmental process for the understanding of sequences of images. and in comics in particular. And I first started seeing this with various studies I'd see would talk about people who didn't understand a sequence of images, and there was this broad assumption that everybody understands a sequence of images. And as you said, it's used in these assessment tools or aids, support, educational supports. It's also used implicitly in a really large amount of psychological tasks. And almost never is sequential image tasks used to assess sequential image understanding. It's always, here is a sequence of images, and the way you perform on this task tells us about intelligence or sequential reasoning or temporal reasoning or theory of mind or a variety of other things that are not actually the understanding of the sequence of images in the first place.
Yeah,
right?
Maybe they just didn't understand the sequences.
Yeah. So like IQ tests have this picture arrangement task that they do, which is supposedly a measure of people's, I guess, sequential reasoning and things like that. But they never ask people like, how many comics do you read? What's your background in comic reading? And what we show in experiment after experiment, we have a measure that we use called what I call the Visual Language Fluency Index, which is just a questionnaire that asks about your comic reading habits, basically. And it's highly correlative to all sorts of measures, experimental measures. It correlates with your choices that you make in saying good things are good or bad sequences. It correlates with reaction times, correlates with brain responses, unconscious brain responses get modulated by this measure of just how often you read comics.
Is that like the N400 and
N400, things like that.
Cool.
So the acquisition of the visual languages via reading comics, let's say, does modulate how well you do on these tasks. So one of the things, as you mentioned, this sort of work that I did where I kind of investigated, like, okay, to what degree are people can people understand a sequence of images? And usually the bare bones thing that gives you the ability to understand a sequence is, can you understand that this character here is the same as the character in the next panel here? That's what, as you refer to as referential continuity. So it's, you look at this set of lines is this character, this set of lines is this other character. Let's say Charlie Brown. So this set of lines I know is Charlie Brown. This other set of lines I recognize as Charlie Brown. I have to connect those as being the same character. Now, if you don't know the character of Charlie Brown, you just have to know this set of lines corresponds to the character that is also in this next panel. And then on top of that, you have to know that the way those lines might change is indicative of a change of meaning also, like it changes in time now across panels. So what you actually see in various studies, oftentimes which we're not trying to study sequential images, usually cross-culturally, is various people can't understand this referential continuity. So I had I would give talks at places and I'd have researchers, particularly anthropologists, sorts of people or linguistic anthropologists say, oh, I was in this country and I was testing Aboriginals and they couldn't understand that these were the same character. I showed them three characters and it's supposed to be that they have a beard is growing across the images. And they said, oh, those are three different people, but they're brothers, which is why they look similar. Or it's three images of a banana that's supposed to be interpreted as being peeled, and they say those are three bananas.
Crazy, yeah.
So that's a lack of referential continuity. So I had all these people the same story kept coming to me from personal communication from researchers, and then I saw some little mentions of this in papers, and I thought, well, how extensive is this? So I just started research archaeology of going through as many papers as I possibly could. You bounce from reference to reference and, things like that, finding papers that reference this one, references this one. And you just find suddenly there's all these studies where you realize, oh, actually, this is not that uncommon for people to not understand a sequence of images. And they're almost never in the context of trying to study the sequential image understanding. It's always people trying to do it for something else. And so you end up with this picture of, well, the common thread usually is these people were not exposed to comics, which they don't, or visual narratives, which they don't usually mention. Usually they talk about things like literacy enculturation, Western enculturation, things like that. But that's, enculturation comes with it, sequential pictures. So then I thought, okay, well, what about with kids and what kids are doing? Because there's all these tasks that we use sequential images in with kids. And I thought,
Yeah.
You can kind of look through papers and say, okay, well, what are these kids doing when and stuff. And then I decided, it's better to do some sort of analysis. So I just compiled results, no matter what the tasks were trying to do, just what's the mean accuracy. And what you see is just this really by age line that's just increasing from youth up to, up to, let's say 10 years old is our highest thing. And that's just averaged across 3 different types of tasks that people use sequential images with. They have the same line, and it's all just an incremental growth across ages. So that suggests to me that none of these studies that are claiming, whatever those studies are claiming, they're claiming to study theory of mind, they're claiming to study sequential reasoning, time understanding. I don't think any of those results actually are telling you about those things. I think they're all telling you about whether the kids understood a sequence of images or not.
Yeah, so
and
crazy.
and the crucial age seems to be around 4 to 6 is when kids start getting continuity. Is what I call continuity. I will say my son is my older son is 3, and I do check in with him every now and then on his continuity understanding. And I read to him like every night, and so I do this with the picture books that we read. And sometimes it's hard to understand because you can ask kids things like, is that the same character as that? Is that the same as that? And they'll just say whatever. You don't know what a 3-year-old's going to say. But where I'm at right now, and he actually doing this with him made me realize there's a second aspect of this, which is I don't think that he can make the connection between 2 images right now at age 3, but he can create an abstract understanding of a certain character and then knows when that character appears repeatedly. So we have a Mickey Mouse book that I read him, and he knows that this image here is Mickey Mouse and that this image here is also Mickey Mouse. So he's able to connect those graphics to an abstract notion of that character, but I don't think entirely making the connection across the images as a sequence of images. So that's a slightly different process. And one of the things that doing what he is doing gives you an advantage for is that you no longer have to connect directly across images. So if you don't have an abstract understanding of, say, a particular character, here's just a novel thing that is, cross sequential images, that you have to do on the fly because you haven't yet abstracted the notion of what this entity is. You just have here's a set of lines, here's a set of lines, I have to connect them. That's what people do in these experimental tasks where there's not recognizable stuff for them. But my son is not doing that because he's already able to say, well, that set of lines is Mickey Mouse, which in my mind, I know already can connect. This set of lines is also Mickey Mouse. I can connect that to an abstract, what I would call visual lexical item of Mickey Mouse. And now he has a leg up for getting the continuity between them because he's already has an abstract understanding of what that lexical item is in graphics.
Yeah.
That he can make a connection between the images on the basis of the shared lexical item as opposed to using the similarities of the graphic lines to suggest a connection, right? So there is this additional step that might be involved of if you can just recognize that things are consistent and have an identity. And that's one of the reasons why cartoon characters are really helpful to do this. Because if you go, oh, that's Garfield. Now I know every instance of Garfield is a Garfield. It makes it easier for me to connect them across images when I am ready to be learning about this sequence.
Cool. Yeah. Oh, that reminds me of just using, if we in speech therapy we would have carrier phrases or something that's I want this, I want that, and you say it the same way across context to help kids understand the function of some phrase. But it's easier to do that when you have if you're saying it differently across all the different places that you're asking for something. And I think it makes it more difficult, right, to make those connections. It's sort of like this sort of scaffolding that we have that helps us
Yeah,
maybe develop
absolutely.
those. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think all of this goes back to, you know, one of the key things about just the capacity of language across all modalities is just pattern recognition and
Hmm.
formation, right? And again, linguistics has had a tendency over the last 100 years to really emphasize, say, words as the building blocks of language. So you have words, so
Right.
you have your bucket of words, and then you have your rules for combining those words. But in fact, the vocabulary of language is not just words. It has things that are smaller than words, like individual morphemes, and with those morphemes, you can create new words. And new words are an inherent part of speaking language. It's not like, oh, it's not in the dictionary, that doesn't exist. That's just a regular part of language production, is to create new things out of the languages you speak. That's again a bias inherited from writing systems. A dictionary
Hmm.
that's about
Hmm.
writing
Yeah.
instead of what you do with speech. But there's also things larger than words. So there's stock phrases that we use. There's idioms. There's these phrases with slots where you fill in certain things. Those are all things that we store as part of our lexicons that are just part of our
Hmm.
normal lexicons. And graphics are the same. Graphics are just filled with varying levels of patterns that we recognize as being encoded patterns in our visual vocabularies. So the way in
So
which
cool.
certain characters are drawn is a pattern that I would call a visual lexical item. Um, but there's, visual lexical items of a variety of sorts. It's both the way in which you draw parts of bodies, so the way you draw hands, eyes, noses, that creates an inventory by which you use to draw. But it's also the abstract things, like we have affixes and things like that in graphics too. So all the stuff that floats above characters' heads, hearts above the heads, gears above the heads,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's a whole class of affixes basically, and there's a ton of these that are out there, um, and they are highly regularized and oftentimes abstracted into broader classes of things. So and different drawing systems do this in different ways with different complexities. So it does vary across the types of drawing systems around the world effectively.
Yeah.
So this is all patterns that you're using in different ways, in the context of speech therapy. What you're describing is a construction that you're using in varied ways, as opposed to say, you know, saying the same meaning in a different construction every time. I'm now, as I
Hmm.
said, I have a 3-year-old who is, repeating everything I say. So I hear a lot of, wait a minute, which he doesn't break down as to separate words. That's one word to him because he hears me say it. Or, so I'm aware that I say, wait a minute, hold on, as a variety of different things of saying,
Yeah.
wait. um, then he's picking up all of them, but those are effectively the same meaning. So I'm sure if I just stuck to one, he would be more consistent, but he's getting now part of his language acquisition process is to get a whole variety of things that I happen to say. So it's actually good in his context that he's hearing me say lots of different things in different ways. So
Yeah.
yeah, so these are all
Getting a
just
lot of
pattern
variation.
recognition. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it makes sense. And like it feels like the Jenny Saffron sort of statistical learning thing in language applies to the graphic modality, and that we
Yeah.
pick up
Oh
the
yeah.
statistics of our, sort of visual experience.
I
Um,
think that's absolutely the case. And that is also a factor in why I think there's relative proficiency for people in drawing visual languages. So if you think about, given our the way in which our cultural ecology is set up, speaking happens constantly where people are, speaking to a learner, let's call them a child. So the child is getting that statistically rich signal, and they are urged to repeat it back to the person, have an interaction maybe. So that's a constant, thing. If you think about it in terms of the statistics of the things that are in the signals, so the patterns in the
mm,
signals, you're getting a very rich signal all the time. Graphics, we constrain to certain contexts. Let's read at bedtime now. Here's graphics in this thing that you're engaging with. And even more narrow is the opportunity to produce those graphics. So
mm,
when our
yeah.
kids drawing, it's not that, we are constantly drawing to children and showing them graphics and then eliciting them to draw back to us the same way that we do with speech. So the statistics of the signals are greatly reduced. And then what that means is the people who get really good at drawing have to overcome that social bottleneck for those signals. They have to, you know, as I did in high school, spend a lot of time just at home drawing,
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
become
Same
really
thing
good
with
at
music
drawing.
practice.
So
Yeah.
yeah, because when else
Spending,
you have to do the practice. And
yeah.
it also tells you something about the relative complexity of how easy or not certain drawing systems are to learn. So manga, which we mentioned before, have really highly conventionalized, systematized features, right? So there's a very distinctive manga style, you can say, that you could recognize across authors. Of course, authors have their own individual voices, visual voices, let's say, but
Yeah.
there's a highly regularized manga style, which makes it easier for a learner because they can learn that particular style as opposed to, and it can be, fairly complicated, but can also be fairly simplistic on some types. If you are trying to draw like really complex, say, superhero comic styles, it's a much higher bar for
Yeah.
proficiency because of the degree of complexity of what's happening in that graphic system
Well,
versus
it's
a
like,
more cartoony style, which is going to be a
yeah.
lower bar
Yeah.
for being proficient because the patterns are simpler to acquire.
Well, it reminds me of like the katakana, hiragana, and then the kanji,
Yes,
you're not going to start with like a bunch of kanji and just
right.
learn them all.
Right, right. And
Yeah.
and in hiragana and katakana, there's a huge inventory of both of them and redundancy, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So in the Japanese writing system is like really complicated because of that, because there's so many scripts to balance and
Yeah.
juggle and the functions of all of them and things. There's and degrees of complexity across them. And
Yeah.
the hanja from Chinese versions of kanji are even more complicated oftentimes, and that's been a thing in China to reduce the complexity of some of the characters, right? Um,
Yeah.
on that note, I will say, um, if you're talking about writing systems, I talked about writing systems as being drawings of sound, so to speak. That is also, though, not entirely accurate because all writing systems retain aspects of meaning. And they have a balancing act between the degree to which the graphics are conveying sound and the degree to which they are conveying meaning. And we tend to think about, say, spoken like the alphabetic systems as highly efficient because you can do all this stuff with just these few letters, and then Chinese characters are really inefficient because you need to learn so many more characters. But that's not entirely accurate because you still need to learn the spelling of all the words in the alphabetic system.
Yeah. And
And those
they're
words,
irregular.
and they both might be irregular or regular. You still learn the whole word spellings, right?
Yeah.
So it's just that the building blocks, you have a particular degree of building blocks, but like kanji also have building blocks of strokes and radicals and things like that. So one case that I like to point out is, say, there are imbued meanings that are functional within the alphabet. So in the case of, say, the word psychology, the spelling is PSYCH as a root. You see PSYCH, that is not pronounced with those
Yeah.
canonical,
So, yeah.
canonical letters for that pronunciation. But the fact that it has that spelling is functional for letting you know that there's something mindy about this
Yeah,
thing
true.
that you
Yeah.
are spelling. It has an inherent meaning to that spelling. Um, uh, 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 Words that are spelt that sound the same but are spelt differently, it's functionally different spellings. So there, and there, bear, B-E-A-R, and uh,
Bear,
bear,
B-A-R-E.
B-A-R-E. There's like tons of these homophones, right? Where you have these different spellings. In some cases, those pronunciations are actually pronounced differently depending on the dialect that you speak of English, let's say, if we're talking about English specifically. There may be the spellings actually do signal different pronunciation because of
Uh-huh.
the dialect you speak, or the variety is a better way to say it, the variety you speak. But In other cases, the spelling, even though it sounds exactly the same, the spelling has serves a functional purpose, and that purpose is to differentiate meaning. So it's not that, oh God, English has such a bad spelling because there's so many ways to spell the same things that sound the same. It's that the writing system is not inherently about sound reproduction. It's about
Yeah.
balancing sound reproduction and meaning. And
Okay.
so those are functionally there to help you differentiate the meanings. And you have to
Interesting.
know
Yeah.
that, just like you have to know that Chinese characters have meanings associated with them. So it's not
Yeah.
the efficiency argument falls apart once you really break it. Once you get beyond well, with a set of letters, you can do anything. Well, yeah, but you also need to know how to pronounce the whole words at
Yeah.
stored ways, and then it's back to the same footing again.
Yeah. Yeah. It seems like there's that tension between on the one hand, like if it's too like idiosyncratic, it just gets crazy. But if it's too regular, you have to put too much energy on resolving ambiguity. Like
That's right.
you're like there's too much pressure on that
Right.
cognitive
And
mechanism.
And the Chinese writing system and Japanese writing systems do this also because there's tons of homophones there as well. They have different
Yeah.
characters they use for them. Sometimes you get the inverse, which is that you have the character is used for repeated for sound, certain sound things, but then it dissociates from the meaning. So it has both the version where this character has this sound and has a meaning, and this character has just the sound but not the meaning anymore. But then it's paired with something
Yeah.
else. So you
Yeah.
get these very complicated, conflations and combinations between things that is the same as you get in English writing and but it's just doing it functionally in different ways because the system works slightly differently in the way that it's packaging the balance of meaning and sound.
So interesting. I was wondering if I could just ask you a couple
Yeah,
really quick
sure.
questions, like speech therapy related, sort of speech therapy related ones. One
Yeah.
is about transfer, like, and then like, so if you do learn, how much does this learning, like how to draw comics and understanding that language, how much does that help you potentially in, maybe the vocal modality? And then also about like how language disorders might they show up in the visual domain? Like, could you see that in the way that kids um, are having trouble like in this process? I mean, it's hard because the issue is that like most kids or a lot of kids do not need to use it or they don't have a lot of experience with it. So obviously that's a huge piece and maybe the main piece in the vocal modality as well. But yeah, I'm just wondering what you think about those two sort of
Yeah,
ideas.
they're both very fascinating questions, and I don't have clean answers for them. I will
That's
say
keep
right
keep it
away.
messy.
So the first part is in terms of transfer. Does, say, learning to draw help you learn to speak? Um, I don't know entirely. I think there are suggestions of some of this, and certainly insofar as you have a multimodal system, they are not independent, fully independent, but they're semi-independent, but not fully independent. So there might be, bleed between the systems, and we're investigating some of those things. But ultimately, part of the notion of this as being a multimodal system is it's one system. It's not here is speech as a behavior, and that's over here, and here's drawing, and then they interact. Those are again the heads of a common body, and so there may be this percolation and interaction, but I don't know enough to speak to it directly. I can say, with regard to transfer, this is another piece of evidence that our modalities are natural modalities that we already have, because you can't really transfer between them in an accurate way. There's a
Hmm.
couple examples of this. So one is in the bodily modality. Signed languages, natural sign languages persist around the world in numerous varieties. There's American Sign Language in America is the most prevalent, compared to something like manually signed English, where you push, say, deaf signers to sign English with the body, but maintaining the rules and every morpheme and
Mm.
part of English. And generally, this does not work that naturally. And oftentimes, the signers end up kind of pushing the system to gravitate towards something that's more of a natural sign language. So you can't just shove one modality's language into another modality easily and have it completely be mutable, which would be what you would expect in a fully amodal system. There are affordances, that's the constraints that we talked about before, affordances of each of the modalities. On the flip side is the idea that you can push, say, speech into graphics with pure pictures, having pure picture languages. So the idea here, which is used in sometimes in cases of disability and whatnot, where they say make a picture language for people to press buttons of or something like that, or in various attempts to create universal writing systems that are feel like pictorial, say like bliss symbolics, if you know of bliss symbolics.
Mm-hmm.
These don't work because you are trying to force the graphic system to obey the principles of a spoken language system. And graphics don't work the exact same way. They have the same building blocks, cognitive building blocks, but they do it in slightly different ways. And you get this again right now in discussions of emoji, where people say, are emoji a new language or could they become a language? My answer has always been no. It's always going to be way too constrained as an expression by virtue of the way that emoji are constructed, and we already have visual languages, which are the way people draw naturally. Emoji are a highly constrained version of this. And the example I like to give is, which we did in an experiment. If you were to express, say, the notion of an apple tree in emoji, you have to have an apple emoji and a tree emoji in a sequence, because that's imitating the way it would be like in speech, right? And you have to have that compositionally across two different units. But the natural way to draw that is you draw a tree and then you put little apples in it.
Yeah.
Right? Not a unit by unit sequence. So, and we find that indeed people are worse at this emoji sequence version than a compositional picture version of this. So graphics have certain ways in which they structure information that is more natural to the graphics than trying to shoehorn it to operate the way that we think, say, writing systems work. So that transference issue is another sign that they are parallel systems that are not completely amodal and mutable between them.
Yeah. Thinking back to like the statistical like environment argument, like I imagine that like, you don't see like when you're growing up, you don't see the, that temporal structure in graphics in that way. And so it doesn't make sense. You would have this weird, like, what is this? I'm like confused by what's going on here.
And they're really hard to decode. People have really a hard time understanding what they are. I love those examples that I have of like people who've tried to make picture languages, and they have these like sentences that they say, this is going to be a universal way of expressing this, sequence with a sequence of pictures. And I put it on the board for my students. They go, I have no idea what this is. And then I show them and they go, there's no way I could have gotten that. But you put a comic strip on the board, and as long as they have comprehension and ability of having proficiency in comics enough, they understand perfectly fine as a sequence. That's because that is a natural visual language, and the other one is not a natural visual language. So my advice is to stop trying to make universal visual universal writing systems and picture languages. We already have them. They're not universal. They're just drawing. It functions the same way as language anyways. The other question you had was about disorders.
Language disorders.
Language disorders. So that's a very fascinating question. I have looked at some and have research programs related to certain disorders that we associate with language issues. So, for example, in autism or developmental language disorder, DLD. And there, again, people often try to use sequential images as supports and things like that. I have a collaborator, Emily Coder, who I work with. We have a whole program about autism, and I have a collaborator, Annika Anderson, who we've been doing stuff with DLD. And Emily stresses what she calls the visual ease assumption, which is this general pervading idea that graphics are easy, languages are hard, and we should use graphics because they're easy to understand, to help overcome the difficulties with language comprehension. And what we've been showing is that this one is founded on kind of faulty assumptions to begin with. And
Yeah.
also, people who have autism, again, broadly, it is a broad statement,
Right.
but they don't always do great with images also. And
Yeah.
in proficiency tests with people with DLD, they also show, I don't always say deficits, but differences, let's say, in the
Mm.
comprehension of sequential images also. And in my book, Who Understands Comics, which is the one that I talk about the proficiency stuff, I also have a chapter that goes through uh, studies related to autism, studies related to DLD, studies related to schizophrenia,
Oh,
where you
great.
do
Yeah.
see similar sorts of things happening across spoken and graphic modalities. Um, and, you know, a lot of the explanations for what these um, uh, disorders or conditions are cognitively don't necessarily have grounding in being something about language or about modalities in the first place. So a
Mm.
lot of times, if say, there's a variety of theories of what autism may be. Let's say the central coherence as one type. So that is that they focus on, it leads to a focus on, say, small stuff without the kind of top-down
Yeah.
knowledge.
Or
If that's your
cognitive
theory,
awareness.
yeah, if that's your theory of what autism is, which I'm not saying it is or isn't, why shouldn't graphics be affected by that? That's a domain general sort of, you know,
Yeah.
condition potentially that could affect across modalities. And again, I think it's better to speak in terms of differences rather than disorder because, it can be advantageous
Right.
to have that sometimes also to have that narrow focus on
Yeah.
things. So it's not necessarily, you have to think in terms of what is normative
For
also.
sure. For sure.
Um, but there are cases where graphics and sequential images are affected by the same sorts of things that are affecting spoken languages. And the itemization of that, I don't think has been done fully for which things affect which things. And to go back to like assessment discussion, like, you know, neural disorders, people ask people to draw stuff
Yeah.
when assessing neural conditions, nobody ever asked those people what their prior drawing experience was or their
Yeah.
proficiency.
Yeah.
So
It's like if I gave a test in Spanish to like an
yeah,
English
like yeah,
speaker, I would have to ask them first, like, do you speak Spanish? Like versus
yeah,
like,
exactly.
yeah.
Like why would that? Yeah,
Yeah.
there is just another broad level assumption when you talk about the relationship between language and thought. There's a highly controversial theories that like the language you speak affects the way you think, right? But for some reason, we take it for granted that there's an assumption that drawings directly reflect your thinking as an individual.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah.
But like, why would we think that? Like, it's the exact inverse of what we think about language,
Huh.
as if that's just the baseline, that what you draw is a direct reflection of your, innermost, way
That's
of
so,
perceiving and
yeah.
thinking about the world.
I feel like I
As
carried
opposed
that
to just a,
assumption
a
just right
pattern.
until now. Yeah.
Just as
Yeah.
opposed to it's a set of patterns that you've built up over time through
Yeah.
your learning exposure. And some
Wow.
people
Okay.
have different levels of that. It's not a direct access to your visual thoughts and your thinking necessarily. So that's just another
Wow.
way in which we conceptualize these modalities differently, even though they're probably the same. Like they are parallel to each other. It's just we don't think about them in those terms. And
Yeah.
that's largely just to go to a plug. That's largely what my graphic novel is oriented around, is these differences in conceptions by which we think about graphics as being highly different than language. But then when you actually tear off the seal, they actually look really the same. It's
Yeah.
just that we have a different frame, cultural frame that we've built up about how they work.
Amazing. So where's the best place to find your book online?
Uh, I think bookstores everywhere, as far as I know. Hopefully you can order it at any bookstore. My website is visuallanguagelab.com. If you go to
Visual language lab.
visuallanguagelab.com, you'll see the cover of my book front and center, and you click on that and it'll take you to the page that has it. And there's a variety of ways to purchase it. Obviously, ordering at local bookstores is always nice to promote your local economy, but you can get all over the place online as well. So
Cool.
speaking in pictures, to give the big plug of my broad
Speaking pictures.
audience accessible book, is
Yeah.
it's a graphic novel that I drew. about all
I
this
definitely,
research.
yeah, I love that you have like both sides. I want to get both, like, I want to hear that from both perspectives, like what is the multimodal language faculty and speaking pictures.
Yeah,
That's really cool.
I kind of like had a strategy where I knew in order to have this stuff taken seriously, because people look at often, you study comics, that's fluff. Um, I had to build up the kind of academic credentials, and then I could draw my graphic novel. So I have these very academic books, and then I now finally have my graphic novel
The
to
important
complement
stuff.
it. So I would say if you want the easy to understand, more fun version, get the graphic novel. That's my advice.
Awesome.
But the
That's so
academic ones
cool.
hopefully are informative too.
I really like, I think it's amazing how you're putting this stuff together. It's like something that I've sort of yeah, I really look up to that because it's something I want to do in that, like, I've always like music's kind of the first love and like, and also like just trying to get some of the research stuff like into these places where it never gets to. And like, how do you
Yeah.
do that in a way that's like accessible and fun and creative? And
Yeah.
so you're really putting all these things together. So yeah, thank you so much, Neil, for it's been awesome talking to you, and thank you for this reframe. I feel like it's such an important perspective for like us as therapists to get familiar with, if not even just for the fact that like we show kids comics all the time without thinking about this really important idea that maybe they don't have any fluency in this, like in this language. So
That's right.
yeah, thank you so much. Any last remarks or conclusions you'd like to leave us with?
Oh, just thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a really interesting conversation. I really enjoyed the way we discussed everything. And yeah, people are welcome to reach out to me if they have further questions. My website is visuallanguagelab.com, and there's like everything I've ever done on there. And it's pretty easy to get a hold of me. So yeah, thanks very much for having me, and I hope people take something away from the discussion.
Awesome. Well, yeah, we'll put that in the show notes, and it was a pleasure and an honor. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Stay curious. Hope to see you in the next episode. I'm just going to stop the recording.